So hi everybody. So I am Karen McPhail and I'm the Heritage Learning and Access Assistant at Campbeltown Museum. For those who don't know, Campbeltown Museum is run in partnership between Charts, Livergyle and Argyll and Bute Council. I can see some Charts members have joined us tonight, but for those who don't know Charts, it's a digital facing membership guided organisation that advocates the need for cultural activity in Argyll. Now, over the past 2 years, Charts and Campbeltown Museum have been proud to take part in live literature events. Live Literature is a Scotland-wide programme that supports author events and communities, and in the past we have worked with authors to explore the museum's collection. We are so delighted this year to have this event taking place during World Gaelic Week as well. So I'd like to introduce our author for the evening. This is Dougie Strang. He is an author and storyteller. He's going to share a few tales relating to the folklore of Argyll, bringing intangible heritage, oral traditions and place to life. Dougie Strang is a writer and storyteller who is interested in ways that stories, both personal and cultural, can be entangled with places. He studied folklore at Edinburgh University and though currently based in Scottish borders, has made home in Argyll at various stages of his life. He is currently writing a book on the themes of exile and belonging, with a focus on Argyll and some of the key folk tales that are woven into its landscape. So I'd like to hand you over to Dougie, who will take you over.
Thanks, Cara, and thanks, Kirsten, and thank you very much for the invitation to be part of tonight, and welcome to all of you. This, for me, it's really lovely to be part of this. I mean, in some ways, I'd love to be over in Campbeltown itself, but actually, there's something really nice about being able to link through the medium of Zoom. And I'm really, I'd encourage you all, if you're not already members of Charts, just to check out their work and to go and visit Campbeltown Museum. But since we're not there in person, really what I want to do, we don't have loads of time tonight. And as Kirsten said, I'm hoping what you can do is just kind of sit back and enjoy an introduction, a kind of little inroad into stories, place, and particularly we're going to be focusing on Argyll. I think one of the things for me, maybe in all the work that I do, certainly in my last book and in this book that I'm writing, is I really want to encourage that sense that the stories that we tell really anchor us to the places where we live. And this is as true today as it was traditionally. And I'm pretty sure if I asked any of you to reflect on a place that has some special meaning for you, you'd very quickly be able to tell me a story about it. You know, whether it's the garden that you grew up in as a child, or it's where you spread your granny's ashes, or it's where you propose to your partner. You know, these places are held in our memories through the stories that we tell about them. And traditionally, and this has always been the case and still is today, obviously, and traditionally, what might have happened more would be that our personal stories would be intertwined with the kind of folklore and mythic stories that were told of that place. And just to kind of give you an example of that, and to show you that this is still a living culture. Cara said, my wife and I, we live in the borders now, but about a year, we've been here for about a year, but previous to that, we were on a hill farm in Argyll. We were there for a couple of years. And the old woman who owned the farm was in her late 80s when we were there. And she'd lived there for about 65 years on that farm. But it wasn't where she was from, and that's this very lovely Scottish thing about where are you from. It's really important. And when she would be quizzed, well, where are you from then? She'd actually moved about 10 miles up the coast. This is mid Argyll. So it's real kind of localism here. It wasn't where she was from, but she lived just down the coast. And where she lived looked across the Sound of Jura to the north end of the island and the narrow strait between the north end of Jura and the island of Scarba, which many of you may know, is known as the Gulf of Corryvreckan. It's this remarkable feature on the coast there. This whirlpool. It's actually the third largest whirlpool in the world, and it's the particular kind of geological feature of that narrow gap between those two islands. And what you have is you have the Atlantic getting pushed up the Sound of Jura between the mainland, up from the Irish Sea, getting pushed up, and then it goes through this bottleneck between Jura and Scarba and creates this at high tide. It creates this remarkable whirlpool. And there's lots of contemporary stories of boats floundering there. George Orwell, when he lived on Jura, writing 1984, he nearly drowned. He and his son nearly drowned. He'd mistimed the tides, and he was coming through the strait in his boat, and it was swamped. And they actually had to they were grounded on a little islet between the two islands, and were rescued by a passing fisherman. So there's lots of contemporary stories about the Gulf of Corryvreckan. But the old woman who owned the farm that my wife and I worked in for a couple of years, she, on our first meal that we sat down to dinner with her, she told us this story about the Gulf, and it was what really struck me was how much this story, and she was in her late 80s, her mind was wandering a bit, but when she told this story, she was absolutely focused, and it was like she was remembering something from her own childhood. And it was that sense that this story of this place really mattered to her and really allowed her, cultivated in her a sense of her belonging to that place. And the story concerns a king, the king of Scarba. Now, those of you who know the island, Scarba is just this tiny little rocky island. But back in the day, every island had its king, a chieftain. But the king of Scarba, he had a daughter, and she was renowned. She was very fair, she was very gentle, she was very kind, she was bright, she was graceful, and pretty much everybody, every young nobleman in the area had fallen for her. But the answer when they went courting and asked the king of Scarva for his daughter's hand in marriage, the king, who was a bit of a kind of grumpy old soul, he said, "Sure, you can marry my daughter if she'll have you. All you have to do is spend a night moored in the Gulf of Corryvreckan, and in the morning, if you're still there, you can come and you can marry my daughter." And that soon cooled the ardor of all these young suitors, because everybody knew that that was suicide and madness to spend a night in the Gulf, and they'd be gone. And the poor young woman, whether she had a fancy for these young suitors or not, she didn't have a chance because none of them braved it. But there was a young prince out of Norway who came over from across the North Sea down the west coast, having heard of this remarkable young woman, and decided that he was going to come and he would fall for her and they would be married and that would be fine. So they sailed down the west coast, moored off Scarba, and he goes and asks the king if he can have his daughter's hand in marriage. And he says the same that he says to all the young suitors: "Sure thing, no bother. If she'll have you, you can marry her in the morning, but all you have to do is moor out in the Gulf of Corryvreckan." Now, this young prince of Norway was pretty canny, and he'd heard about the Gulf of Corryvreckan. He knew how dangerous it was, and he said, "Well, I'll tell you what, give me a month and a day, and I'll come back and I'll do exactly that. I'll moor for a night in the Gulf." And as quick as he could raise his sails, he races back up the west coast, across the North Sea, back to Norway. And when he lands at his people's place, he sends for all the weavers and rope makers, and he says, "Right, fetch for me all the strongest hemp you can find, and I want you to weave together, plait a rope of hemp, the thickest, strongest rope of hemp that you can weave. In addition," he says, "I want you to go and gather all the finest supple silk that you can find, and I want you to weave a supple rope of silk that will yield but won't break. And finally, he instructs his people, he says, what I want you to do is shear the hair of all the maidens of this part of Norway, only true maidens, mind you, and we're going to weave together a rope of maidens' hair that will have all the virtue and strength of these maidens." And so it's done. 3 cables of rope are woven, loaded on the boat, and they sail back across the North Sea, down the west coast, quick as they can. And sure enough, a month and a day, they arrive back at Scarba. And he goes to the shore and he greets the king. And if the king's impressed by his punctuality, he certainly doesn't make any show of it. He says, "Oh, well, you're here. I guess you'll be wanting to go out and moor in the strait." And he says, "I will. And in the morning, I'll marry your daughter." And the king says, "Well, see about that." And off they go. They sail out and they moor the boat in the Gulf of Corryvreckan, and they cast 3 anchors, one with the rope of hemp, the thick, strong rope of hemp, one with the rope of silk, the supple rope of silk, and the third rope made from maiden's hair, as strong as the virtue of the maidens of Norway. And they settle in for the night. And the tide's rising and the night's coming on, but the boat is so well held by these three anchors and these three ropes that the prince is confident that all will be well. And just as they're approaching midnight, the tide's coming up to its fullest and the water is surging. It's surging up the Sound of Jura into the strait and it's pummeling at the boat, and this great whirlpool is being created and the boat's holding and holding, and then there's this mighty surge of water, maelstrom of water, and it hits the side of the boat, shudders, heaves to one side, and what do you know, the rope of hemp, the thick rope of hemp snaps. And the men are all wailing, but the prince said, don't worry, we've still got the supple rope of silk and we've got the rope of maiden's hair, all will be well. And so they trust the prince, trust his knowledge, and they carry on through the night, and middle of the night, early hours of the morning, the tide is just surging and it's at its fullest. And of course, the boat gets hit by this other great surge of water, and it stretches, and the rope of silk, it stretches and stretches, and then it just can't anymore, and it snaps, and the boat gets thrown to the side, and the men wail, and the prince says, don't worry, we've still got the rope of maiden's hair, the virtuous rope of maiden's hair. And it seems indeed that this will hold. And the dawn's just beginning to colour the horizon, and they've nearly made it through the night, and the tide is beginning to ebb, and they think they're okay, but then just almost like the sting in a scorpion's tail, there's just this final surge of water comes barreling through the strait, pushes up against the boat, throws it to one side, the rope of maiden's hair snaps, and the boat goes down. And in the morning, the king hears that the ship has been lost, all hands drowned, including this young prince of Norway, and of course his daughter is heartbroken. But the king, he only says this, he says, well, it seems that those maidens of Norway are maybe not all true to their word. And that's all he says in the matter. And that's this story that it's not a typical folk tale. It's got a strange ending. But what I loved was the old lady, 87, the old lady that told me this story. And she told me it with a kind of gleam in her eye. This old woman who'd divorced young and been a spinster for 60 years. And she was kind of, it was like she was remembering. When she told it, she had this image of this young prince, and she just wasn't impressed by his kind of romantic idealism. And there was a real gleam in her eye when she talked about this idea that these maidens of Norway were maybe not quite so maidenly after all. But what I love about that story is that for the woman who told me it, it was part of her sense of who she was and where she belonged. And there's lots of other tales of the Gulf of Corryvreckan that kind of reinforce this idea of a place that if you live in its vicinity, it's a really big part of who you are. And I think Cara or maybe Kirsten mentioned this idea of intangible heritage, intangible cultural heritage. This is what we're talking about. Stories, culture, songs, traditions of an area. And that's in a way what we're celebrating here. And what I love, I was asked to kind of reflect on the museum at Campbeltown, and we're not there, but I like that idea that in the museum you've got all these paintings and artifacts. They're the kind of material culture. And then we've got these stories and songs, and that's the kind of intangible, what UNESCO call intangible cultural heritage. And the two complement each other. There's a lovely Gaelic word, dúlachas, which is exactly that. It's that idea of cultural heritage. And this is what we're talking about here. We're talking about the dúlachas of this area. And even if you may be steeped in Gaelic tradition, or you may be having just moved to Argyll, we can all, if you like, cultivate that sense of dúlachas, which is just learning about the stories of place. And when I try to maybe slightly tenuously link these stories to, because I'm not actually in the museum able to go, well, here's a painting that can illustrate this. But I know that in the museum there are some of the medieval grave slabs. I think is the Kilcrennan stone, I think. And these slabs, if you're not familiar with them, you'll find them throughout Argyll. They've got some in Campbeltown Museum. They've got plenty out in the Isle of Iona. And these are they're mostly from the kind of late medieval period. They're the grave slabs that were laid on the graves, mainly of kind of clan chiefs, usually, kind of aristocracy, nobility. You had to be pretty high status to get one of these slabs carved for you. And invariably, what's carved on them is either just a sword, or often it's a figure of a warrior in chainmail, or it might just be the kind of helmet of a warrior. And what these slabs tell us is that, well, they speak of the culture of the time, really, and that idea that in Argyll, when you go back to, I mean, actually as late as 16th, 17th century, it was a warrior culture. It was a culture that extolled the virtues of warriors. And it was also a bardic culture. And what the bards did was they sang the praises of these warriors. And the stories that come down to us from that time really are just reinforce this idea of chivalry in both in battle, but also in the court, in the hall. And what I'm going to do is I'll move as I was telling you a story from Mid Argyll there. We're going to kind of come down the coast a bit. We might even end up in Campbeltown, but we'll come down the coast a bit to Tarbert, which is in kind of Kintyre. And we don't have a lot of time tonight, so I'm not going to be able to really dig into some of the epic stories that are associated with Argyll. But what I can give you is little snippets that will hopefully encourage you to go and learn some of these stories yourself. But just south of Tarbert, on West Loch Tarbert, there's a little village. It's like there's literally just a scattering of houses called Turk, which from the Gaelic is Hill of the Boar or Crag of the Boar. And I don't know if any of you have been there, but just down from the village, there's a standing stone, and it's known as Dermot's grave, or the giant's grave. But locally, it's known as Dermot's grave, and there's a chambered cairn there as well. Um, and again, some of you will have heard of Dermot, but if you haven't, he's one of Finn MacCool's men, and Finn MacCool's this great hero of the Gaels, both of Scotland and Ireland. And Finn MacCool was the kind of chieftain of this warrior band. They were a kind of Celtic samurai, and they were probably around the kind of Iron Age. So we're talking a couple of thousand years back. That culture of kind of warrior men protecting the land. But those stories have stayed with us, and certainly the people who were getting their grave slab carved, these likenesses of warriors, those people would be those stories from the time of Finn MacCool, they would be alive in their imagination, and that was what they aspired to, and that culture really remained with us right through into modernity. And Dermot's grave in Tarbert, there are lots of Dermot's grave. The other thing about that idea that stories anchor us to places. Now, you hear a story, and what you do is you localize it so the landscape around you becomes the kind of theatre within which the story takes place. So there, on West Loch Tarbert, there's Dermot's grave, and it's no coincidence that it's next to Turk, the hill of the boar, because indeed the story of Dermot ends with his death, gored to, well, he's actually poisoned by the poisonous spines of this great boar. Now we don't know whether in this particular instance, the place name Turk was there before, and then the story was attached, or the story was told, set there, and that became Turk. But it's that way that stories become entangled in places. And I've done quite a lot of research on the tale of Dermot, and it's one of the great stories. And if you don't know it, I mean, we'd have to be here all night for me to tell you the tale. So, but go. I mean, best go hear someone tell it, but second best is go and read the story. It's a beautiful story, and it's often set in Ireland, but it's also set all the way up the west coast. So there's another Dermot's grave in Glenlonnan, further to north in Argyll, but there's also one in Perthshire, and there's one up in Sutherland. The one in Glenlonnan, which is a chambered cairn that's known as Dermot's grave, and it was excavated early in the 20th century. And we have an account from the archaeologists that they're in the middle of this excavation of this Bronze Age chambered cairn. And a local woman comes up to them and she's really concerned. And she says to them, I hope you won't be removing the bones of Dermot. So for her, that idea of, these tales, we think of them as myths, but for her, it was a literal truth. That was Dermot's grave. He was buried there. This is the 20th century, and these archaeologists were messing around with her heritage, her belief that this hero was buried there. So it really, I hope I can impress upon you that blurring of literal truth and mythic truth is quite an exciting area to explore. And for all of us, wherever we live, once you start digging into stories related to places, it can help to blur those fine definitions between literal and mythic truths. Um, but the story, and I can't tell you, but it involves the pursuit of Dermot and his lover Gronya by Finn McCool and his men, and it's a beautiful account. And I think, particularly with a slant on Argyll, it's worth saying, these stories, they're often claimed by Ireland, and it's like, oh, well, the Scot, they just kind of migrated over here. But actually, the kind of experts, and I'm not an expert, but what we're beginning to realize is that idea that traditionally it was believed that around about the third, fourth centuries, the Scots, the people that were known as the Scots, came over from Ireland and kind of colonized or settled in Argyll. That that version of how it happened is challenged these days, and there's more that idea that there was always a toing and froing. The people who were in Argyll, the Gaelic speaking people of Argyll, were always coming back and forth between Northern Ireland and Argyll. So it wasn't quite the case of, yeah, everything just came over from Ireland. It was always a two-way thing. And when we think of the sea road, back in that period that we're talking about, the sea was the roadways. You didn't really go inland. Inland was kind of often impassable. So that sea road between Ireland and Argyll has always been a really well-traveled stories passing back and forth, as well as culture, trade, all of that. And what I'm just conscious of time. I think what I'm going to leave you with, we've got about another 10, 15 minutes, and we're going to move even further south down Kintyre, down the coast. And just to pick up on probably I certainly think one of the most beautiful epic tales in the Celtic tradition, which is the story of Deirdre. And again, some of you may well have heard of Deirdre and the sons of Uisne. It's just, again, I could be here for days telling you this story, but it's one of the great Celtic stories. And what's rather lovely is it's Argyll's a big part of it. Just to give you a ridiculous short summary of it, basically, Deirdre she's kind of like a Celtic Helen of Troy. She's this incredibly just beautiful woman who is trouble, and it's not her fault, but she's so beguiling that she was actually kind of kept away from the sight of, never mind just men, anyone, every man, woman, whoever you were, you would just be utterly beguiled by this woman. And she's promised to the king Concobar of Ulster. But through a whole series of unlikely events, she ends up with the eldest son of Uisne, and the two of them elope. It's a little bit like the tale of Dermot and Gronya is a kind of echo of this earlier tale. But they elope, they run away, and of course Concobar is furious and chasing them. And eventually they have to leave Ireland, and they set sail, and they of course come across to Argyll, and they travel up the coast, and eventually in the tale they settle in Glenetiv in the north of Argyll. And again, I've done a little bit of research around the story, and what's remarkable is you go to Glenetiv today, And the place names in Glenetiv are just littered with references to Deirdre and the sons of Uisne. You know, there's the fort, there's a fort that's the fort of the sons of Uisne, there's a woodland that's the wood of them, there's Deirdre's garden. So it's this idea that these stories are really held in place, almost to the extent in this case that you wonder whether there is actually some historical truth in this tale. It's so rooted in a particular landscape. But regardless of that, what we do know is that for generations, this story was told. And one of the snippets that come from this epic tale is this idea that as they're sailing from Ireland and they hit Kintyre and they're traveling up the coast, and there's the three sons of Uisne, and there's Deirdre, and there's their retinue of kind of their best men. So it's like 50 warriors, and you imagine them sailing in these berlins, these traditional sailing boats up the coast. And for those of you that know that coast of Argyll, dotted along the coast are these hill forts, duns. So, you know, almost like every 5, 6 miles, you'll see the remnants of like an Iron Age hill fort. And in the story, the sons of Uisne, they kind of they land at every one of these forts, and they go up and they offer their services to the chieftain of the fort. Now, normally, if these three warriors, you know, you've just got to imagine these strapping young men turning up, armed, bold, graceful, with a retinue of warriors with them. But they come in peace and they're offering their service. And normally they'd be welcomed, you know, because back in the day there was plenty of land to give to men who were willing to pledge their service, and that's what they were doing. They were looking for a place where they could pledge their service in exchange for a place to stay. Who would refuse such wonderful men? And really, and it's just this lovely little snippet that comes down to us that actually what happened was they kept getting refused. And the reason they kept getting refused is the wives of the chieftain would whisper in their husband's ear, "Send these men away. We don't want them here." And when questioned why, they wouldn't say, but what it turns out is that they got a glimpse of Deirdre and they knew there would be trouble. They knew there would be trouble if this woman, and it's poor soul, it wasn't her fault, but they knew that if Deirdre came to live there, it wouldn't be long before there'd be fighting and brawling, possibly even their husbands, the chieftain, would be involved, and it spelt trouble. So they were sent on their way. And there's something really kind of, for me, quite poignant about that. I mean, we have to remember that the sort of sensibility of the times were different to today. So there's something about um, it's a little bit troubling, this idea that beauty can cause so much trouble. But nonetheless, this is the story. And all the way up the coast of Argyll, they went, and everywhere they landed, sought refuge, pledged their service, and everywhere the wives sent them on their way again. And eventually, what they realized was that they had to hide Deirdre. So they kind of she was kept on the boat, and it was only when they sailed into Loch Etive and spoke to the chief of Glen Etive and pledged their service, and he said, "That's great. You look. Come on in, lads. You're great. Come and join us." And they gave them land, and they built their fort, and they settled there. Um, and they kept poor Deirdre out of sight. And and actually, what happens in the story is that, and you know, and these men, these fighting men out of Ireland who settle in Glenetiv, and they gain renown because every time there's a skirmish, the chieftain knows he can just call in the sons of Uisne, and they come and basically sort it out. So they're kind of really well loved and respected, and very happy there. But eventually, the one of the servants of the local chieftain catches sight of Deirdre walking in the woods and goes back and tells the chief, "Look, you know, the deal is, I think there's a woman who you're going to want to marry, and she's, you know, betrothed to one of the eldest son of Uisne," and that kind of begins the end of their time there, and they end up having to go back to Ireland, and they're persuaded by the King of Ireland that it all will be well, they're forgiven, they can come back. And Deirdre doesn't trust this for a minute, and she doesn't want to leave. But the three sons are keen to get back to Ireland, to their homeland. So there's this kind of standoff between them, and eventually they persuade her that all will be well if they go back. And what comes down to is there's some early Gaelic poetry that's kind of spoken in the words of Deirdre, and her farewell to Glen Etive. Again, I would urge you to check it out. It's some of the most kind of beautiful early poetry, where she just sings the praises of Glen Etive, and it's really poignant because it feels to me, and one of the things I'm researching in my new book is this idea of belonging and exile. And this story really is a story about love for place and exile from. So it's a really kind of rich source of material that I think is relevant to all of us as we try to figure out what it means to belong to a place. And again, I won't tell you. I mean, that's just the half of it. But they have all sorts of adventures when they get back to Ireland, and it doesn't end well, sadly, for Deirdre or the sons or the three brothers of Ushna. But that's often the way of it. Now, how are we doing for time? Got a couple of minutes. What else can I tell you? I realize I've been probably talking 9 to the dozen, trying to give you a kind of whistle-stop tour of just how rich the story culture of Argyll is. And really, I hope what I can do is encourage you to go and do some exploring yourself. And actually, wherever you are, it doesn't matter whether you're in Argyll or not. One of the things that I've discovered in my researching is that wherever you are, begin to dig in. Local libraries are usually really good sources, online, really good sources. You find that, every place brims with stories, with culture, with dúchas, this idea of intangible cultural heritage. And that's the kind of that's the work, folks. I mean, I think that's what you guys are doing at Charts, is trying to encourage us all to cultivate our own dúchas, whether we're generationally attached to a place or whether we've just moved in the last decade. We can begin to cultivate a sense of belonging through stories, through our own stories and stories of place. And I think maybe I should draw a breath and call it quits at that. Is that about right timing wise, Cara, Kirsten? How does that feel? Yeah. Yeah. Great. I'm going to stop talking. Thank you for listening. I wish in a way I mean, the one thing about doing these things online is it'd be really lovely to actually be sat around a fire with you all. And then, we could be exchanging stories, because that's one of the key things about the storytelling tradition. We're all storytellers. We've all got stories to tell. And I'm not actually used to kind of dominating the space and just talking at you, but I hope it feels like a sharing, and maybe one of these days somewhere down the line I'll get to hear some of your stories. But thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Dougie. That was so wonderful. It's so nice to hear about Argyll because I'm from there, so it's really nice to hear something about that. And thank you to everyone in the audience for coming tonight. A little reminder that this was recorded and will be available at a later date. If you wish to keep up to date with our work and find out more about future events, please just keep in touch with our social media, the Charts website, and the newsletter as well. And I hope to see you all in the museum very soon. So good night, and thank you for coming.
Great. Thanks, Karen. And thank you all very much for listening.